Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the Second Temple period of Jewish history, a crucial epoch stretching roughly from 515 BCE to 70 CE.
For a huge span of time.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to truly understand how Jewish identity, faith, and practice were forged and, well, dramatically reshaped under the constant shadow of powerful, successive empires.
Right.
We'll explore how fascinating internal divisions emerged and diversified, and perhaps most compellingly, how a truly powerful and multifaceted idea, the Messiah, deepened, evolved, and inspired a people, all leading up to a cataclysmic event that would reshape the religious landscape forever. We've compiled a rich stack of articles, scholarly research, and historical notes that paint a vivid, intricate picture of this complex and incredibly fertile era.
What's truly fascinating here, as you've highlighted, is that this wasn't a static period in the slightest.
No, not at all.
Think of it less as a tranquil garden and more as a historical pressure cooker,
Yeah.
A dynamic crucible where external imperial forces relentlessly met deep-seated internal convictions.
That's a great analogy.
And what emerged from this profound tension was something both new and enduring. 600 years is an almost unimaginable stretch of time, encompassing generations upon generations.
It really is.
And the developments within it fundamentally impacted everything that came next. It laid the groundwork not just for what Judaism would become in the Rabbinic era, but also, crucially, for the emergence of Christianity.
Absolutely. Key point.
We're talking about a world of constantly shifting empires, intense cultural clashes, and a truly remarkable, complex evolution in religious thought and practice.
Let's begin at the very genesis of this era, establishing its profound foundations. This entire period is effectively bookended by two immense, almost unimaginable traumas for the Jewish people, both involving their holiest site.
Right, the beginning and the end are marked by devastation.
Exactly. It kicks off with one of the deepest collective wounds in their history, the Babylonian exile, which commenced around 586 BCE, and with it, the devastating destruction of the First Temple.
A foundational trauma.
This wasn't merely the physical loss of a building, it was an existential earthquake. Imagine if the very core of your spiritual life, the place where you believed God uniquely resided and atonement was made for an entire nation, was utterly destroyed.
Unthinkable.
It was a catastrophic blow to their religious identity, their national sovereignty, and their very understanding of God's presence among them, shaking them to their core.
Yeah, it questioned everything.
But then, the narrative takes a surprising, almost miraculous turn for the time. In 538 BCE, the powerful Persian king Cyrus issued a decree, a truly astonishing act of clemency, allowing the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem.
Which was quite unusual imperial policy for the ancient world.
Yeah, absolutely. This act of tolerance, especially coming from a conquering empire that had just subsumed the Babylonians, was quite remarkable. Unlike previous empires like Assyria or Babylon, which often sought to crush local identities and assimilate conquered peoples.
Cyrus had a different model, benevolent oversight almost.
Right, recognizing the value of stable, loyal populations, even allowing them to worship their own gods. And of course, the monumental project once they returned was the rebuilding. After years of effort, the Second Temple was finally completed and rededicated in 515 BCE.
A huge moment.
This was far more than a simple construction project. It was a powerful, tangible symbol of renewal, a physical manifestation of their resilience, and the desperate reestablishment of their identity and connection to their God. It represented a collective breath of hope after decades of despair.
Exactly. The profound significance of the Second Temple truly cannot be overstated. It became the absolute central pillar of Jewish life, the beating heart of their spiritual and national existence for centuries.
The anchor.
The anchor, precisely. Its existence defined their worship practices, particularly the sacrificial system, their communal gatherings, and the very rhythm of their religious year. It was the physical anchor of their entire civilization. And to truly grasp the full scope of this transformative period, we have to fast forward momentarily to its dramatic and equally devastating conclusion.
Yeah, the other bookend.
As you noted, the era is defined by the existence and eventual loss of this central symbol. In 70 CE, after years of growing tension and ultimately devastating siege, the Roman general Titus captured Jerusalem and ordered the complete destruction of this very same Second Temple.
It's gone.
Utterly destroyed. This duality, the construction, the long period of its centrality, and then its ultimate brutal obliteration, perfectly bookends a truly transformative era.
It really does frame everything.
Over this vast span of 6 centuries, Judaism was in a constant dynamic state of adaptation, responding to and being shaped by successive powerful rulers. First, the benevolent oversight of the Persians,
Which we just touched on.
then the pervasive cultural currents of the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander the Great, and finally, the formidable iron-fisted rule of the Roman Empire.
Each bringing new challenges.
Absolutely. Each successive imperial power brought new pressures and profound influences, leading to significant changes in Jewish religious thought, worship practices, and crucially, the emergence of distinct sectarian groups within Judaism itself, all grappling with what it meant to be Jewish in a constantly shifting world.
So if the Second Temple was this central anchor, how did these different empires, each with its own unique approach to conquered peoples, shape Jewish life on the ground, in the daily realities of people's lives during this period?
Right.
Let's break it down chronologically and see how these external forces played out, testing and forging Jewish identity.
Okay, let's start with the Persian period then, running from about 538 to 332 BCE. What truly set Persian rule apart from their predecessors, like the Babylonians, was their remarkably enlightened and tolerant policy.
That's Cyrus' decree?
Exactly. Cyrus's decree wasn't merely a permission slip for the Jews to return. It explicitly permitted, and even provided resources for, the rebuilding of the temple.
Which is huge. Not just, you can go back, but we'll help you rebuild.
Precisely. This was a stark reversal of previous Assyrian and Babylonian imperial policies, which often involved forced population transfers and the suppression of local cults. The Persians believed that stable, self-governing populations allowed to practice their own religions would be more loyal subjects and, frankly, better taxpayers.
Makes pragmatic sense, I suppose.
It did. And under this benevolent Persian suzerainty, there was a profound and critical period of religious reconstruction within Judea. This era was absolutely crucial for the compilation, editing, and shaping of what would become some of the fundamental texts of the Old Testament.
So the scriptures themselves were being formed?
Yes, books like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, which recounted their history and reestablished their covenant with God. This process of collecting and codifying their sacred literature was essential for establishing a shared religious and national identity after the trauma of exile.
Giving them a unified story again.
Exactly. A guiding set of laws, even in the absence of full political independence.
So it wasn't just about a physical building. It was about defining who they were, solidifying their collective memory and future through their sacred texts. That makes so much sense.
Precisely. And alongside that textual consolidation, the reestablishment of the temple brought with it a highly organized religious leadership, in particular the Zadokite priests.
Okay, who were they exactly?
They claimed direct lineage from Zadok, the high priest, during King David's reign. So they had historical legitimacy, their institutional power soared. They were, in essence, the established religious royalty of their day, holding immense authority over ritual and law within the temple.
Gotcha, the establishment.
Pretty much. The social order within Judea became quite structured around the temple and its functions, with clear distinctions between the priests, the Levites who assisted them in their duties, and the general populace. This hierarchy was vital for maintaining religious norms.
Right, and Persian rule itself, how hands-on were they?
Well, from a governance perspective, while Persian rule was certainly impactful, they levied taxes and appointed regional authorities. Naturally, their general hands-off approach to local religions allowed Jewish religious life to flourish with a considerable degree of internal freedom.
So pay your taxes, keep the peace, and worship your God.
Largely, yes. They were more interested in tribute and stability within their vast empire than in imposing their own gods or cultural practices. It created a space for Jewish religious life to reconstitute itself.
That relative freedom under the Persians sounds almost idyllic compared to what came next. And this is where the narrative takes a really fascinating turn, because Alexander the Great's meteoric conquests completely changed the landscape of the known world, ushering in the Hellenistic period from roughly 332 to 164 BCE.
A seismic shift.
Suddenly, Jewish society found itself immersed in a vibrant, powerful new culture. How did Greek language, philosophy, and political power truly impact Jewish society?
It was a monumental transformative shift. Alexander's lightning campaigns brought the entire Near East, including Judea, squarely into the Hellenistic world, forever changing its cultural trajectory.
No going back.
No. And with that came a deep and pervasive Hellenistic influence, a cultural wave that touched nearly every aspect of life. We're talking about the Greek language, which quickly became the lingua franca, the common, shared language for everything from administration to commerce and intellectual discourse across the entire region.
So even if you spoke Aramaic or Hebrew at home, you needed Greek for business, for dealing with authorities.
Increasingly, yes. Greek philosophy, with its emphasis on reason and logic, began to challenge traditional thought. Greek political structures, and perhaps most visibly, a vibrant urban culture with gymnasiums, theaters, and public baths permeated the region.
Sounds like a total cultural immersion.
It really was. And then, after Alexander's sudden and untimely death, his vast empire was fragmented amongst his generals, known as the Diadochi.
Right, the successor kingdoms.
This led to a period of intense struggle between two of his primary successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies, based in Egypt, and the Seleucids, dominating Syria.
And Judea was stuck in the middle.
Exactly. Geographically, it was prime real estate, a constant strategic buffer zone, a battleground caught right between these two powerful Hellenistic empires. It shifted control between them several times, which naturally impacted its political and social stability, creating uncertainty and demanding constant adaptation.
So Jewish society was now directly exposed to this incredibly powerful, dominant, and in many ways very appealing culture. What was the reaction? Did they universally embrace it, or did they resist, or was it more nuanced than that?
Oh, absolutely nuanced. It was definitely a mix, and this spectrum of reactions led to significant internal diversity and, crucially, escalating conflict. Some Jewish communities, particularly in the burgeoning coastal cities like Akko, which became Ptolemais among the wealthy elite, began to enthusiastically embrace Hellenistic culture.
The cosmopolitan set, maybe?
You could say that. Urbanization increased, new trade routes brought wealth and ideas, and Greek education became a clear path to advancement and influence. For these groups, adopting Greek customs, language, even leisure activities like participating in the gymnasium or attending Greek plays was seen as a natural and even beneficial part of living in the Hellenistic world. It was a way to integrate, to prosper.
But not everyone felt that way.
Not by a long shot. Many others, particularly those rooted in traditional practices in rural communities, vehemently resisted. They viewed Hellenistic practices as a fundamental threat to traditional Jewish religious customs, laws, and ultimately their unique identity.
So a real culture clash internally.
A profound one. This tension between assimilation and staunch resistance became a defining, almost explosive feature of the period. And crucially, one of the most profoundly significant religious developments of this era was the translation of Jewish sacred texts into Greek.
The Septuagint.
Exactly, the Septuagint. This monumental undertaking was vital, especially for the burgeoning diaspora communities. Jews living outside Judea, many of whom no longer spoke Hebrew as their primary language.
So it kept them connected to their scriptures.
It did. It allowed them to access their scriptures in the common tongue of the day, making them accessible to a much wider audience, including, importantly, non-Jews who are curious about Jewish monotheism.
This raises an important question then. How did translating these deeply rooted texts into a new linguistic and philosophical context impact their interpretation? Did it lead to maybe theological debates?
Absolutely. The act of translation itself is inherently an act of interpretation. Think about it. You're taking concepts deeply embedded in Hebrew thought and trying to find equivalents in Greek, which has its own philosophical baggage, its own nuances.
Yeah, words carry weight.
They certainly do. Certain parts might flourish differently in Greek. New meanings might emerge based on Greek philosophical concepts, maybe subtly shifting understanding. And it undeniably opened Judaism's sacred wisdom to a non-Hebrew-speaking world, an act that would have unimaginable consequences for the future of religious thought, paving the way for later religious movements.
Like Christianity, for instance.
Precisely. It was a bridge, but one that inherently shifted the ground beneath their feet, linguistically and conceptually.
And this cultural pressure, this tension you're describing between embracing Hellenism and resisting it, ultimately reached a boiling point, didn't it? The Maccabean Revolt is a famous example that many people, particularly around Hanukkah, might be familiar with.
Indeed. The Maccabean Revolt, which erupted from 167 to 154 BCE, was the direct, inevitable consequence of this escalating cultural and religious tension.
What was the spark?
The trigger was the Seleucid king Antiochus V Epiphanes. He was a ruler who believed in aggressive Hellenization and saw Jewish distinctiveness as an impediment to his empire's unity.
So he decided to force the issue.
Drastically. He implemented truly drastic measures, attempting to Hellenize Judea by brute force. He banned fundamental Jewish religious practices, forbade circumcision, observance of the Sabbath.
Core practices.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And most heinously, He utterly desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. He dedicated it to Zeus, erected an altar to the pagan deity, and according to tradition, sacrificed pigs on it, an act considered an abomination beyond comprehension for pious Jews.
Just deliberately provocative and offensive.
Intolerable. This was a direct, deliberate assault on their core identity, their covenant with God, and their very existence as a distinct people. The response was a massive popular revolt, not just by a few individuals, but by a substantial portion of the population, led by the Hasmonean family, particularly Judah Maccabee.
The hammer.
Exactly. His nickname means the Hammer. Their goal was unambiguous: to restore Jewish independence and, most importantly, religious freedom and purity for the temple.
And they succeeded, remarkably.
They did. The outcome of this incredible David and Goliath struggle was a remarkable and hard-won victory for the Jews, culminating in the rededication of the temple, an event still celebrated today as Hanukkah.
The Festival of Lights.
Right. This was a profound moment of self-determination, a testament to their unwavering religious identity and their refusal to compromise on their core beliefs. It was a powerful assertion that religious freedom was worth fighting and dying for.
So after that hard-won, though relatively brief, period of independence under the Hasmonean dynasty, a new, far more formidable power enters the scene in 63 BCE, Rome.
Enter the Romans, yes.
How did Roman rule differ from the Persians or the Hellenistic kingdoms, and what was its profound effect on Jewish society?
The Roman period, stretching from 63 BCE to that fateful year of 70 CE, marked yet another, arguably the most impactful, profound shift. When the Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem in 63 BCE, it brought Judea firmly under Rome's heavy, calculating hand.
No more tolerance like the Persians.
Not in the same way. Unlike the earlier Persian tolerance or the more culturally pervasive, but less politically direct Hellenistic influence, Roman rule was characterized by direct, often brutal political intervention, heavy and systematic taxation, and the appointment of local client rulers.
Like Herod the Great.
Exactly like Herod. Rulers who were beholden to Rome rather than their own people. This approach, designed for maximum control and resource extraction, created significant and ongoing unrest within Jewish society, simmering just beneath the surface, often erupting into open rebellion.
Constant tension.
Absolutely. Throughout this tumultuous period, the temple in Jerusalem continued to hold immense significance, but it operated in a complex dual role.
How so?
It remained the undisputed religious center of Jewish life, the focus of worship and pilgrimage, no question there. However, it also became a critical political center, a focal point for power struggles.
Politics and religion intertwined.
Deeply. For instance, the high priesthood, once a lineage-based religious office, became essentially a political appointment, often granted by Roman authorities or their client kings, like Herod, to those deemed loyal to Rome.
Which must have undermined its religious authority in the eyes of many.
Precisely. This created constant friction and power struggles between the temple priesthood, who traditionally held immense authority but were often seen as collaborators by the populace, and the emerging rabbinic leadership, particularly the Pharisees.
We'll get more into them soon.
Yes, who were gaining influence among the common people through their emphasis on Torah study and daily practice, often critical of the temple establishment.
So, what was the Roman approach overall? Did they try to stamp out the religion?
Not exactly. The Roman approach was pragmatic but unyielding. They generally respected the temple's religious authority, understanding its central role in Jewish life. You don't unnecessarily provoke such a deeply held belief, but they maintained strict political and military control over Judea.
Keep the peace, collect the taxes, prevent rebellion.
That was the goal. This dynamic created relentless tension. Rome wanted stability and taxes. The Jewish people yearned for freedom and divine justice. This fundamental clash of interests created a volatile atmosphere, constant resentment, and ultimately fueled the increasing desperate expectation of a deliverer, a Messiah, who would finally liberate them.
So, amidst all these relentless external pressures, from Persian tolerance to Hellenistic cultural clashes to Roman dominance, internal Jewish society was far from monolithic. In fact, it was incredibly diverse. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right, it was buzzing with different ideas.
This period saw the flourishing and deepening of distinct religious and social groups, sometimes forming uneasy alliances, often in fierce opposition to one another. What were these key sects, and what set them apart?
This is absolutely critical for understanding the true vibrancy and profound complexity of Second Temple Judaism. We see four main groups consistently described in historical sources like Josephus, and whose ideas are reflected in various texts of the period: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Zealots.
Okay, let's start with the Sadducees.
All right, the Sadducees. They were primarily tied to the aristocratic priestly families and the wealthy elite. Their power base was undeniably the temple itself.
So the establishment group we mentioned earlier.
Very much so. Their beliefs were quite conservative, theologically speaking. They emphasized only the written Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, as divinely authoritative.
Just the written law.
Yes, they explicitly rejected the concept of an oral law, which was being developed and emphasized by other groups, particularly the Pharisees. They also did not believe in concepts that were gaining traction in broader Jewish thought, such as the resurrection of the dead or the existence of angels and spirits.
Interesting. Very focused on the here and now and the temple rituals.
Exactly. Their primary concern was the correct functioning of the temple cult and the preservation of its purity and sacrificial system. Their power and influence were deeply intertwined with the temple's existence, so after its devastating destruction in 70 CE.
Their whole world vanished.
Pretty much. The Sadducees, as a distinct sect, effectively vanished from the historical record. Their power base, their reason for being in many ways, was gone.
Okay. Then we have the Pharisees. They sound quite different.
Very different, yes. These were popular teachers of the law, often scribes and scholars, and they were particularly influential among the common people in towns and villages throughout Judea.
More grassroots.
You could say that. Unlike the Sadducees, the Pharisees embraced both the written Torah and a developing body of oral law.
Ah, the oral law. What was that exactly?
It consisted of traditions, interpretations, and applications of the written Torah to everyday life. It extended beyond just temple rituals to encompass things like dietary laws, kashrut, Sabbath observance, purity rules in the home, basically, how to live a holy life day to day.
Making the law relevant outside the temple.
Precisely. They also believed in the resurrection of the dead, the existence of angels, and divine providence concepts that resonated deeply with broader Jewish popular piety.
More aligned with common beliefs, perhaps.
Generally, yes. And crucially, their emphasis on synagogues, which were local gathering places for prayer and Torah study, and on the study and application of Torah to everyday life, meant that their form of Judaism was highly adaptable.
Which proved vital later.
Absolutely vital. It ultimately allowed Judaism to survive and thrive after the destruction of the temple. Their focus shifted religious practice from a centralized sacrificial system to a decentralized, text-based, and community-oriented one. It was a revolutionary shift, really.
Okay, third group, the Essenes. What were they about?
The Essenes are fascinating. This group tended to live in more isolated ascetic communities, often withdrawing from broader society.
Why withdraw?
Primarily due to their intense focus on ritual purity and their deep disillusionment with the temple priesthood, which they saw as corrupt. We link them strongly to the Qumran community near the Dead Sea.
Ah, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Exactly. Their library, the Dead Sea Scrolls, has given us an incredible, unparalleled insight into their beliefs and practices. The Essenes held mystical and apocalyptic teachings.
End times focus.
Very much so. They emphasized extreme purity, communal living, often sharing property, and a fervent expectation of the end times. They believed in the imminent arrival of a cosmic battle between good and evil, and saw themselves as the true remnant, the sons of light, preparing for God's final intervention. They emphasized strict adherence to their interpretation of the law.
So a very intense, separate community preparing for the apocalypse.
That captures a lot of it. They lived a disciplined communal life, often abstaining from marriage, and were deeply engaged in ritual washings and prophetic study.
Okay. And finally, the Zealots. They sound different again.
Yes. These were less of a distinct religious sect in the same way as the others, with a unique theology and more of a radical political movement, though deeply rooted in religious fervor.
Politically motivated.
Intensely. Their focus was absolute, uncompromising resistance to foreign domination, particularly Roman rule. They advocated for armed rebellion to achieve liberation from what they viewed as oppressive, idolatrous foreign powers.
God's warriors, in their view.
That was the idea. Their core belief was that God alone was the true king of Israel, and therefore any foreign human rule, especially Roman rule, with its emperor worship, was an affront to divine sovereignty. This fueled their commitment to revolutionary action and martyrdom.
And they played a role in the war against Rome.
Hugely influential. They were instrumental in igniting and driving the major Jewish-Roman War of 66-70 CE, believing that divine intervention would surely grant them victory if they fought courageously for God's kingdom.
It's genuinely fascinating how distinct these groups were, especially given they all considered themselves authentically Jewish, striving for what they believed was the truest path. What stands out to you about how these groups, despite their very profound differences and sometimes outright animosity, collectively contributed to the incredible pluralism and intellectual dynamism of Jewish society during this pivotal period?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, these diverse interpretations are a testament to an incredibly vibrant, dynamic, and intellectually charged religious landscape.
Not stagnation, but ferment.
Exactly. They weren't just isolated factions or minor disagreements. They represented fundamental, deeply held differences in approach to faith, law, identity, and the very future of the Jewish people. You had the Sadducees upholding tradition and temple authority.
The establishment view.
Right. Then the Pharisees, innovating, broadening religious observance to everyday life, making it more accessible and ultimately more resilient.
The popular reformers.
Then the Essenes, exploring a deeper, mystical, communal piety, seeking purity through withdrawal.
The apocalyptic purists.
And the Zealots, channeling religious zeal into passionate, often violent political action.
The freedom fighters.
You see, their very existence highlights the intense intellectual and spiritual ferment of the time. Ideas about God, the law, national identity, messianic hope, and the future were constantly being discussed, debated, challenged, and reshaped in synagogues, academies, and even on the battlefields.
A constant dialogue, even if it was often argumentative.
Absolutely. It shows a powerful internal dialogue about what it truly meant to be Jewish in a rapidly changing, often hostile world. It wasn't a static, unified religion, but a living, breathing tradition constantly grappling with profound questions.
Through all these periods of foreign rule, internal strife, and desperate hope, one concept gained immense traction and started to deepen in truly remarkable ways: the expectation of a Messiah.
Ah, yes, the messianic expectation, central to understanding the era.
This is where it gets truly pivotal for understanding the trajectory of the period and beyond. What was the origin of this concept, and how did it evolve into such a powerful, even revolutionary idea during the Second Temple period?
Okay, well, the term Messiah itself comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which literally just means anointed.
Anointed, like with oil.
Exactly. Originally in the Old Testament, this term referred quite broadly to individuals who were consecrated for a special office or purpose through anointing with oil, typically kings, like King David was the Lord's anointed, and high priests as well. These were figures divinely appointed to lead the people in some capacity.
So not necessarily a future savior figure initially.
Not in the way it later developed, no.
Yeah.
However, as you rightly point out, in the Second Temple period, this relatively straightforward concept underwent a profound and complex evolution. It transformed from merely referring to an anointed figure into a much more specific, often eschatological figure, a national and religious savior who would usher in a new divinely ordained era for Israel, and, in some visions, for the entire world.
And this expectation grew stronger under foreign rule.
It intensified dramatically, yes, especially under the oppressive Roman rule. As the desire for liberation grew more desperate, the worse things got, the more intensely people hoped for divine intervention through a Messiah.
But this messianic expectation wasn't monolithic or simple, was it? You mentioned different groups. Did they have different ideas about the Messiah too?
Oh, absolutely. It manifested in remarkably diverse interpretations, often reflecting the hopes, anxieties, and theological leanings of the different Jewish groups we've just discussed. We can broadly see maybe three mainstreams.
Okay, what were they?
Well, one prominent interpretation was political messiahship, especially after that brief taste of independence following the Maccabean revolt. And certainly under the heavy, humiliating yoke of Roman rule, many Jews fervently hope for a descendant of David to emerge as a military and political deliverer.
A warrior king.
Exactly, a new King David. This Messiah was envisioned as a leader who would lead Israel in a victorious struggle against foreign powers, drive out the Romans, reestablish an independent Jewish kingdom, and restore its national glory and sovereignty. This was direct, often fervent, religious expression of a profound national hope for liberation and political self-determination. He would be the liberator, the restorer of Israel's earthly kingdom.
Very focused on national restoration.
Yes. Then we had what you might call spiritual or legal messiahship, which was perhaps more prevalent among groups like the Pharisees, though not exclusively.
How'd that differ?
For them, the Messiah was seen less as primarily a military conqueror and more as a leader who would perfectly fulfill the Torah, God's divine law, and crucially compel all Israel to do likewise.
A great teacher or a reformer?
A supreme teacher, a spiritual reformer, perhaps even a new Moses. This Messiah would bring about profound moral and spiritual renewal for the people, guiding them to perfect adherence to God's commandments and leading them in righteousness. They believed this moral reformation, this return to perfect obedience, would ultimately lead to true redemption and the establishment of God's perfect justice, rather than just winning battles.
Interesting. A different kind of liberation.
A different path to it, yes. And finally, a fascinating and increasingly influential interpretation was apocalyptic or cosmic messiahship.
This sounds like the Essenes, maybe.
It aligns well with some Essene thought found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and also appears in texts like parts of the Book of Daniel and apocryphal books like 1 Enoch. Here, the Messiah was depicted as a universal savior, often a pre-existent heavenly figure, sometimes called the Son of Man.
A divine figure, almost.
Yeah. Often portrayed that way, yes. This figure would participate in a grand, cataclysmic, cosmic battle against evil forces, supernatural evil, not just Romans overcome death itself, judge the wicked, and ultimately establish God's universal reign on earth in a dramatic divine intervention.
Wow, much bigger scale.
The cosmic scale.
Yeah.
This view was a significant part of early Jewish apocalypticism, the belief that history was reaching its climax and God would soon radically intervene to transform the world, setting things right once and for all through a dramatic world-ending event. The Messiah in this context was often a fetcher of cosmic judgment and redemption, not just for Israel, but potentially for the whole world.
So a warrior king, a perfect teacher, a cosmic judge. Quite a range. What was the impact of all this expectation?
The social and political impact was truly immense. It wasn't just an abstract theological concept debated by scholars. It was a powerful, living motivator.
He drove people to act.
Absolutely. It inspired mass social movements, fueled fervent popular uprisings, and critically became the ideological engine behind the major Jewish-Roman War of 66-70 CE, which, tragically, led to the destruction of the Temple. Messianic expectation became a key ideological driver for many of the rebel groups, with charismatic leaders often being hailed by their followers as the long-awaited Messiah.
So hope could also lead to conflict.
Definitely. This deep yearning for deliverance, whether envisioned as political, spiritual, or cosmic, profoundly shaped the actions and destinies of countless individuals and the entire nation, pushing them toward extraordinary acts of faith, resistance, and ultimately tragedy.
And so we've arrived at the defining, truly tragic and transformative moment that brought this incredible 600-year period to a close, the utter destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE. So what does this all mean for Jewish life and identity moving forward?
Yeah.
This wasn't just a physical destruction, a pile of rubble. It was a profound turning point, an earthquake that completely redrew the landscape of Jewish existence and religious practice.
You're absolutely right. The destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans was far more than a physical loss. It was a deep breaking point, a cataclysm that fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of Judaism.
How so? What changed?
Well, the most immediate and obvious thing was the absence of the temple meant the end of temple-based worship and the sacrificial system. This had been the central ritual practice for centuries, the primary means of atonement and connection to God according to that system.
So how do you practice your religion when the center is gone?
Exactly. This forced a radical, necessary, and unprecedented transformation in Jewish religious practice and belief. Without the physical presence of the temple, the entire focus of religious life had to shift dramatically.
From temple to
the synagogue, prayer, and the authority of rabbis. Synagogues, which had already been growing in importance as local gathering places for study and communal prayer, now became the primary communal centers for worship, Torah study, and gathering for Jews everywhere, whether in Judea or the burgeoning diaspora.
The local community becomes key.
Absolutely. And since animal sacrifices were no longer possible as a means of atonement, prayer, Torah study, and ethical teachings, mitzvot took precedence as the primary forms of worship in connection to God.
So internal devotion and study replaced external ritual.
In large part, yes. This transformation meant that Judaism profoundly evolved into a more decentralized, text-based religion centered on a shared canon of sacred texts, the Torah, prophets, and writings, and the interpretations and rulings of learned rabbinic scholars. It shifted from a cult of sacrifice overseen by priests to a cult of the book and community. It was an astounding reorientation.
That allowed it to survive.
Exactly. It allowed it to survive and flourish in new ways, detached from a specific place.
And what about messianic belief? Did that just disappear?
Not at all. But this shift naturally brought new dimensions to Messianic belief as well. The fervent expectation of a Messiah continued, but it had to adapt to the new, painful reality of a shattered temple and a dispersed people.
How did it adapt?
Well, without a physical king or a rebuilt temple in the immediate future, many Messianic hopes began to emphasize spiritual redemption more, or a more distant future fulfillment, or perhaps lean more heavily towards that supernatural cosmic deliverer figure, rather than an immediate political one. The emphasis shifted, you could say.
And this period also saw.
Right. Critically, this period also saw the emergence of Christianity, which understood Jesus as the fulfilled Messiah, a belief that naturally led to a profound and permanent divergence from mainstream Jewish messianic expectations, as Jewish belief continued to anticipate a future Messiah who had yet to come according to their understanding.
A major fork in the road.
A critical and irreversible fork in the road for both traditions, each defining messianic fulfillment in profoundly different ways, based on their interpretation of events in Scripture.
And finally, the diaspora, the communities outside Judea.
Yes, finally, and perhaps paradoxically, the destruction of the temple also profoundly strengthened the Jewish diaspora. While Jewish communities had already been living outside Judea for centuries.
Now they were even more important.
Exactly. Without a central temple to anchor their religious life, these Jewish communities living in various regions across the Roman Empire and beyond became even more crucial for the survival and continuity of Jewish identity. Under the guidance of synagogues and the emerging rabbinic authority, these scattered communities preserved their religious identity, their language for study, their customs.
Making Judaism more portable in a way?
Very much so. It made Judaism a truly flexible, multi-centered, and incredibly resilient religion, capable of thriving even without a geographical homeland or a single central sanctuary. It became a faith carried within the people, their texts, and their communities, not bound primarily to a physical place.
We have journeyed through 600 incredibly dynamic, often tumultuous years, a period filled with seismic shifts and profound transformations. What are the key takeaways, the profound insights from this deep dive that resonate even today, shaping our world in ways we might not immediately recognize?
It's hard to overstate the importance, really. This era is absolutely foundational, not just for Jewish history, but for understanding a significant portion of Western religious and cultural development. It impacts billions of lives even now.
So what are the big ones?
Okay, firstly, the compilation and shaping of holy texts. This period was absolutely critical for the shaping, editing, and interpretation of what we now know as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible.
Foundation document.
Right. It's when many of these texts reached their final authoritative form. And it also saw the emergence of other important apocryphal and apocalyptic writings, texts that didn't make it into the final Jewish canon, but would go on to profoundly influence vast bodies of religious literature and thought, laying the intellectual and spiritual groundwork for so much that follows.
Okay, number one, the texts. What else?
Secondly, the birth of dynamic sectarianism. The emergence of distinct and often competing groups like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots shows us the incredibly rich internal debates and the remarkable plurality that existed within Jewish society.
It wasn't monolithic.
Not at all.
Yeah.
These weren't just minor disagreements. They represented fundamental differences in approach to faith, law, national identity, how to live in the world. It demonstrates the vibrant intellectual and spiritual ferment of a living religion grappling with different interpretations of its core tenets, a real testament to its intellectual vitality.
Got it. Pluralism and debate. Third.
Thirdly, we see incredible cultural and political resilience. Jewish identity was tested to its absolute limits through intense Hellenistic and Roman cultural and political pressures, including active attempts at forced assimilation. Yet it wasn't extinguished.
It adapted. It endured.
Exactly. Instead, it was forged, refined, and made stronger through that fire. This period profoundly demonstrates the power of cultural and religious preservation in the face of immense assimilationist forces and external domination. It's a testament to the enduring strength of a people's commitment to their heritage, their refusal to simply disappear into the dominant culture.
Resilience is key. Fourth point.
Fourth, the development of messianic and apocalyptic thought. The deepening and diversification of the future savior concept and end-of-days expectations during this period was not merely an academic exercise. These ideas became incredibly potent forces.
Real-world impact.
Huge impact, inspiring profound hope, fueling courageous resistance, and ultimately shaping the destinies of entire movements and individuals. This sophisticated thinking about a future redemption had a profound and lasting impact on subsequent religious thought, extending far beyond the boundaries of Judaism itself.
Okay. And the fifth, final, key takeaway.
And fifth, and arguably one of the most impactful legacies for global history, is the birth of Christianity.
Right, we touched on this.
It is absolutely crucial to understand that Christianity, with its core tenets and claims, emerged and developed entirely within this very specific religious, cultural, and socio-political atmosphere of the Second Temple period.
You can't understand one without the other.
You genuinely cannot. It's impossible to understand early Christianity, its messianic claims about Jesus, its understanding of atonement, its initial interactions with Judaism, without a deep appreciation for this complex, dynamic, and often tumultuous historical context. It was the fertile incubator from which a major world religion emerged.
That's a powerful summary of an incredibly rich period. And this raises an important question, I think, for you, our listener. The Second Temple period shows us how a people, faced with constant external pressure and profound internal change, including the unthinkable loss of their central sanctuary, can redefine their core identity.
Fundamentally redefine it.
Transforming a religion that was once centered on a physical place into one sustained by sacred text, by a resilient community, and by an enduring, vibrant hope. How do you see these profound themes of resilience, adaptation in the face of crisis, and the sheer transformative power of belief playing out in other historical contexts you might know, or even in contemporary society around us today? Where do you see communities or individuals redefining themselves in the face of radical change? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Second Temple period, an era that truly laid the groundwork for so much of what came after and continues to resonate today. It really does. If this has sparked your curiosity, we highly encourage you to explore more about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which offer an incredible first-hand window into the spiritual world of the sects of this time.
A truly amazing discovery.
Or perhaps delve into the rich history and enduring traditions of Hanukkah, or even the fascinating early origins of Christianity, all directly connected to this complex, rich, and transformative period.
So much more to explore.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep diving deep into the knowledge that shapes our world.